Hello and welcome to ServiceNation Live for September. A week from tomorrow will mark 20 years since President Bill Clinton signed the National Community Service and Trust Act into law. September 21st, 1993 was the day AmeriCorps and the Corporation for National and Community Service were born. It breathed new life into national service in America, calling for as many as 100,000 Americans to serve up to a one-year term in service to their communities and to the nation. The finished product wasn't all the Clinton administration had asked Congress for, but it was enough to start mobilizing tens of thousands of Americans into service. Today, we will look at that beginning and talk to three people about the future, people who were there at the start. Our guests are Shirley Sagawa, who is one of AmeriCorps' key architects; René Jones, who served during the summer of service that led up to AmeriCorps' creation and is now director of the UTA Foundation; and Rachel Cytron, a member of the first AmeriCorps class and now Assistant Executive Director of Harlem RBI. Here to speak with our guests is the Executive Director of ServiceNation, Zach Moran.
Thank you, Ian, and thanks to everyone who's joining us and watching on ServiceNation.org for the second edition of ServiceNation Live. We have a great group of guests. Let's get right to it. First question for Shirley. You literally have written the book, the legislation, and multiple books on national service and AmeriCorps. Can you talk about the beginning, 20 years ago? What was the vision and how you translated the vision of a domestic Peace Corps into what has become AmeriCorps?
Thanks, Zach. It's interesting because AmeriCorps actually builds on the National and Community Service Act that was passed during the Bush administration, where there was a demonstration project that was set up with a commission. And so some of the decisions about AmeriCorps' design were essentially pre-negotiated in that legislation. Things like AmeriCorps members should have a living allowance, that it should be full-time and part-time, and it should be decentralized so that organizations around the country could start their own programs instead of just having something like the NCCC where it's all federally run. When we negotiated the AmeriCorps legislation, there were a few other things that had to be worked out, like how much should there be an education award and how much should it be? And President Clinton wanted it to be double what it ended up being, but in the course of discussing with Congress, we had to bring it down. And similarly, things like making sure people have child care benefits were really important to the president. So those kinds of elements got done in the legislation. The thing that made it AmeriCorps, though, people are always surprised to find out the word AmeriCorps does not appear in the legislation that created AmeriCorps. So that was probably the first big decision that had to be made in the Clinton administration, what we were going to call this thing. And so, that was decided the night before the president announced the signing of the legislation.
The night before. That's funny.
Yeah.
What do you remember some of the other options?
Well, the only other option that kind of made it to the final two was Core America. So it went to the president whether it should be AmeriCorps or Core America, and we all know what he decided.
I support that. I think that's thanks, Shirley. I want to move over to René Jones out in California. Two-part question for you. You were part of the Summer of Service, the prototype for AmeriCorps. Can you talk a bit about what then inspired you to join this new effort? And then the second part is, when it comes to inspiring today's young people, whether starting early at 16, 18, early 20s, has anything changed with how you might think we need to reach and inspire today's rising generation, the millennial generation, to also consider a year of service?
Okay, thanks, Zach. So it's funny listening to Shirley. I was having flashbacks to how I did come about to be one of the original participants in the Summer of Service. I was a recent grad and had just traveled and backpacked all over Europe, and I'd come back and had this burning desire to want to give back, and the most natural option would have been to join the Peace Corps, which was definitely something I had considered. And I'm from the Bay Area originally, and I moved into San Francisco, and I heard President Clinton give his speech on the idea of a summer of service. And I was so inspired that I actually wrote the White House to want to be part of this movement, because it was very appealing to me to the creation of a domestic Peace Corps. So, through that, I participated in the summer. I was part of the East Bay Conservation Corps, and that fall also participated in the San Francisco Conservation Corps. And it really whet my appetite to want to have service be part of my career, no matter what direction I was headed. And the second part of your question, Zach, I would probably say there's a real opportunity with this current generation. We've all heard and read about the millennials, and a big part of what, service and giving back is a real part of what this generation is interested in. And I really love the idea of, which is so popular in England, the gap year. And I think it's really starting to catch on here as well. And I think this is, if you really combine the millennial interests as well as the idea of taking a year to give back and commit to service, I think there's a real opportunity. And as well as kind of the peer-to-peer relationships that seem to be very important to this generation. So perhaps using, the over 800,000 alumni from AmeriCorps to spread the message, I think that could be very powerful.
Yeah, that's great. And it's interesting, you were inspired by a presidential call to service. I've heard other stories. I know Senator Dodd, who did the Peace Corps, because he says, if you ask me why, it's because the president asked me to. And he describes his life as before the Peace Corps and after the Peace Corps. So, I think it's fascinating that, presidents have, not surprisingly, presidents have such a big role in inspiring people to take up a cause, which we're going to get to President Obama and his legacy on service a bit later, so we're going to think about that. Want to move over to Rachel. Thanks for joining us from New York. There was a lot of, you were part of the first class of AmeriCorps members, and there was a lot of hype going into that with the president. There were advertisements in movie theaters. Can you talk about, how your experience lived up to that hype, what it meant to you at the time?
Sure, Zach. I think it's interesting. I think my experience definitely lived up to the hype. I would say that I joined AmeriCorps as a recent college grad. Sounds like similar to Renee. And at that time, I had finished my studies and wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my life, and had felt that I had reached a point in my life where I hadn't given back in service as much as I had thought that I was going to in my college years. And I actually saw an ad in the paper that said, join AmeriCorps, and it sounded from the ad like a really interesting, fantastic thing to do. And at the time, I thought, this is what I will do with my year, my own gap year, so to speak, post-college gap year. And I joined the program, I served for a year, and I can honestly say that the experience really changed my life, and what I thought was going to be a year of giving back really turned into a career and a way of life. And I would say that I wouldn't even have imagined, in terms of even from looking at the hype of the launch of AmeriCorps, I wouldn't have imagined that my year of service was going to have that effect on me, but it certainly did.
That's great. Now, I think that is something that when we talk to alumni and research backs us up, that it's obviously not just about the year, although that's a big part of it. It's also how are we cultivating the civic leaders that our country needs, which gets us to the next question, and we'll go in the same order. Shirley, we'll start with you. Is there a moment when you can look back over the last 20 years and say sort of your aha moment that this is when I realized this was a big idea, this is going to work, this is something the country needs to get behind?
Well, you have to be working on this for as long as I have. You had to have a lot of faith for a long time that this is the right thing to do. The time I think that I really felt like, this was what the country needed was after Katrina. And there was just so much need, and we just didn't. We always built our disaster response systems around kind of the short-term response, but the long-term rebuilding really required, people on the ground rebuilding institutions, rebuilding, taking over volunteer roles at various nonprofits when people had fled, and AmeriCorps was there in force, and we've seen that same response after Joplin tornadoes, after Sandy. That is one area in which AmeriCorps is exactly what's needed. So I think there are many programs that just inspire me, and I know are doing great work. But to see it operating at the kind of scale we've seen after these disasters, it just makes you realize we really need a lot more of it, and we need it more of the time.
That's great, thank you. And René, over to you. Is there a defining moment, an aha moment, when you said that we're onto something here?
That's a great question. Look, I see it every day in my day job. I'm fortunate enough to work with so many fantastic organizations that utilize AmeriCorps volunteers on a regular basis, whether it's Habitat for Humanity or the work we do with City or Los Angeles, although it's very similar. And I just feel that it's such an important resource our country has, is utilizing these young people who want to give back, and we all know there's such great need in our communities here at home, and to be able to really capitalize on the spirit of young people and to put them to work and to give back, and as we've been hearing just today on how it can also lead them to potentially have a career where service is a consistent thread. I think it's very valuable to our country, and I think it is something that I value the experience. So for me to have the aha moment, I think it just goes back to I see it every day, and I feel very lucky to have the opportunity to see that, and I think it's all of our job to figure out how we can get others to realize the importance of what AmeriCorps can do for our country.
That's great. Thank you. Over to you, Rachel.
Sure. I would say that my aha moment has been a very personal one in many ways, in which I've worked with young people for a very long time in my life of service, and was really fortunate enough on behalf of my organization, to apply for an AmeriCorps grant, and for my organization to receive one. And in working with the young people that I've worked with for so long, and then have them be part of AmeriCorps service and have them participate in the program. And what has happened in the years that we've had this grant is that young people who have many, many different options in their futures are saying, I want to be part of AmeriCorps. This is something that I want to do. I want to serve my community. And that has been my aha moment, to see and hear young people say, this is a really good option. Young people from all sorts of walks of life that come into the community where I work, and young people from the community where I work in East Harlem, New York, saying that this is what I want to do. I want to serve this community. I want to be part of AmeriCorps.
Great, thanks. Let's take it from the personal to the presidential. We have celebrating, as Ian started out, as all of you know, 20 years from when President Clinton signed the legislation creating AmeriCorps. We then, President Bush, after 9/11, expanded it, I think 50%. And in the first 100 days of the Obama administration, President Obama signed the Serve America Act, which we all know we have some work to do to realize that promise. But any takers on what you think President Obama's legacy could be on service? We've got about 3 yeyears left, and in 3 years, what do you think people might be saying about his legacy on what he did for national service?
Shirley,
did you call on me?
René did.
Okay, so. I think that the president, even though there's just 3 years left and there's obviously tremendous fiscal pressures, still has the opportunity to leave an amazing legacy. And what I think that legacy could be is partly around the work that he's done with the Interagency Task Force, and Wendy Spencer and her great leadership going to other agencies and helping them see how AmeriCorps could actually address the missions of those agencies in a cost-effective way, and at the same time increase opportunities. So that, to me, is a really powerful strategy that it's still in its very early stages, but could potentially yield hundreds of thousands of positions over time. The second thing that I'm really hoping will take off in the next couple of years is a project I've been working on that involves basically a new technology platform to grow and support national service. So I don't want to say too much about that now, but we've had tremendously good meetings with the corporation, and I think there's a lot of potential there to engage the whole country in building service as opposed to thinking of it in a more narrow sense. So he's got 3 years. I think that a lot could happen, and we need to end this administration at a high level. So there's a lot of work to do.
Great. Renee or Rachel, do you want to add anything to that?
I just think that it's an amazing opportunity to have bipartisan support on an issue that really makes a true difference in our country, and hopefully the president will have that.
Great, great. Let's move into a final question before we turn it over to some questions from the interwebs. We're celebrating 20 years now, and let's look ahead 20 years. What does AmeriCorps look like in 20 years, and how are we going to make it, and maybe even more than AmeriCorps, if you want to take it there, a year of service? How are we going to make it, part of the country, part of the culture that I think we all want it to become a part of?
So I think we could. A lot of the work that the Franklin Project has been doing, I think, points towards that, this new technology platform, getting more agencies engaged. I think in 20 years it would be possible to make it for every young person who wants to do a year of service to be able to do it. But to get there is going to require, really every part of society to come forward and help build that opportunity, and for the, intense level of interest we've seen from millennials to continue and extend to whatever that next generation is going to be called. So it's something we can all build, and it's also something that we could, see fade if we're not careful. So this is a time, I think, and I haven't seen this much energy around growth in a decade. So I feel like we're poised to write that story, but we need everybody to be a part of it. And all the AmeriCorps alums out there, that means you telling your story, supporting others, and doing all those things that we know we need to do, but in the course of our busy lives, we don't get around to. It's time, write your congressman, do all those things that are important to sustaining and growing.
Absolutely.
I'd like to add to that as well, having 2 small children, to think that in 20 years they would be the perfect age to participate in a AmeriCorps or similar program. I agree, it takes everybody. I think parents should also be encouraging of their children to partake in this type of program, and knowing that they could then go on to a fantastic career. I think that, it really does take influences from all areas of society. I know I would very much encourage my children to be part of a program like this, and I think that, exactly, we all need to tell our stories so others would know that it's a great starting point into a successful career.
Are you going to say something, Rachel?
Yeah, sure. I would definitely agree with Renee, and I also think, as we followed up earlier, in terms of thinking of a year of service as a gap year is really a fabulous way to market it. I think a lot of young people between high school and college are really searching for something meaningful to do, and a year of service is really a perfect fit. And I think parents can understand that, and I think young people can understand that, and I think colleges could certainly value that as well. So I think it has tremendous potential to be institutionalized on a much larger scale than it is now.
Absolutely. And I actually want to stay with that for a minute and talk about the parents. It's not uncommon where I hear, and when I did AmeriCorps, I did City Year 11 years ago, I would get the question when I told people I was doing something else before going to college. It wasn't uncommon for me to get sort of the look like, is everything okay? Are you lost? And you still often hear, I've heard some parents say, I don't want my kid to get distracted from getting his or her degree. What are we going to do? How do we do that? Because parents obviously are such important decision makers, or adult career centers, guidance counselors. Do you think there's anything we need to do around working with parents and adults in the lives of young people so they realize there's actually a huge advantage? This is something that's good. It's not a detour from life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think so as well. I mean, I think for a lot of parents, it is a bit jarring, or they might still be asking those kinds of questions. And I wonder if looking at those 800,000 AmeriCorps alums, if there's any type of research project that we can do with some of them to talk about whether that year of service really was good for them in terms of their future trajectories, that they didn't get lost, that instead it really turned them on to something that was valuable in their lives.
Yes, and I also think a smart thing to do would be to reach out to the universities, because if you look at programs like Teach for America, they recruit highly from the Ivy Leagues and the top universities. And so if this is also perceived as equal in prestige, then I think that would also be a winning selling point to both the families and the students.
Absolutely. All right, let's move to a question from a viewer.
And our first question comes from Levy. Even though AmeriCorps has a widespread impact, there are several larger signature events from the past 20 years, or are there several larger signature events from the past 20 years that Americans will be able to look back on and think, that's all because of AmeriCorps?
Any takers on that one?
Well, I think this points to one of the challenges that we have in AmeriCorps, is to really be able to tell the story in a profound way. I'm not sure I would describe it as events, but in terms of accomplishments, I think of Habitat for Humanity was dramatically able to expand because they found the AmeriCorps resource and realized that's just what they needed in sites to dramatically increase the number of volunteers they could deploy and the number of houses they could build. That story, doesn't get told very much. Joplin, Missouri, people in Joplin know what AmeriCorps did, and there's been some press around it, but does everybody in the country know? I've always been impressed by a story David Eisner used to tell. He was the CEO of the corporation in the Bush administration, about the schools in Madison, Wisconsin, which decided that they were, the superintendent there decided he was going to wipe out racial disparities in elementary school, and using a combination of AmeriCorps, Senior Corps, and traditional volunteers actually did that over 10 years. So I think we need to write up these case studies. I did a lot of that in my book, but we need to, what are those 10 best stories that we can get out everywhere? And we need to hear about them, because I only know what I know about from, random chance, I think.
That's great. And and we should plug Shirley's book, The American Way to Change, which if you're looking for a holistic, incredible case for service and volunteerism, it's one of the best books out there.
Thanks, Zach.
Sure. Anyone else want to take on Levy's question? How are we going to trace the work of AmeriCorps and some of the signature accomplishments of the next 10, 20 years?
I think, just to piggyback what Shirley's saying, it clearly we haven't done a good enough job. So I think this is something moving into the next 20 years to be able to tell those stories in a real way, so they're inspirational and it makes people realize what a valuable experience it is.
Go ahead, Rachel. Yep.
Yeah, I would also say that part of telling that story is branding AmeriCorps to the larger country. I think folks who have done AmeriCorps and folks who have been affected by AmeriCorps are very comfortable and really understand the name and what it means, but I think potentially the country at large doesn't. They understand city year, they understand different strands of AmeriCorps, but don't see them all as a whole, don't see that AmeriCorps brand.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Ian, next question, please.
Okay, Zach, the second question comes from Amelia. What can regular folks who live in neighborhoods like I do rely on AmeriCorps members so much do to ensure that AmeriCorps is still here in another 20 years?
Well, it's really important that people speak up and write those letters, send those emails, make those calls, show up at the advocacy events. Write about what's going on in your own community on blogs and letters to the editor and other means. I think that there's this sort of sense in Washington that AmeriCorps is this kind of big government program that we don't need, and in reality, anybody who sees it in action on the ground has realizes that this is not what they thought it was. So if you have a story of what's happened, tell it. Sometimes I go online and just Google around, try to find news stories, and I actually find them. But it's a collective action problem, and I know, I'm sure it gets tedious when you get those alerts from ServiceNation. It's time to do something. But Congress decides every year on its budget. So even if you did it last year, you got to do it again. And even if you even if you did it once this year, we're probably at a different stage in the appropriation cycle, and we have to just keep pushing, or at some point it could all go away.
Yeah, and I would just add that if you're in a community or work in a community that has these members, getting the members of Congress out to see the programs has proven over the years to be the most influential way to move the needle. And there's some very, very conservative members, including the member in Joplin, Missouri, were at one point not supportive, and they saw the impact, the staying power, the commitment to the community, and the impact of the AmeriCorps members, and their views on this they not only went from being unsupportive, they went to being very supportive. So there is precedent for this turnaround, but it's a matter of each of us who care about it stepping up and taking ownership over that, because as Shirley said, it needs collective effort. We're just about out of time. Any final thoughts or points that we didn't get to that either of you would like to make?
Thanks for including us in this. It's wonderful to celebrate the 20th anniversary, and let's hope we'll be celebrating the 40th, 50th anniversary someday down the road.
That's right. Thank you, each of you. Really appreciate it. You're such incredible supporters and leaders in this work, and really appreciate you being here, and look forward to getting this up on YouTube, sharing it out, and so more people can hear this important conversation. And we will be talking to you soon. And thank you to everyone who has joined us online live, bonus points, and we look forward to continuing to do this every month. More coming up on the theme next month. And thank you again, and see you around. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks, Zach.
Thanks.